At a depth of 90 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, an isolated mechanical structure rests on a coastal shelf. This single component is the forward fuselage and flight deck of a heavy bomber. Inside this submerged compartment, investigators found a remarkably preserved but not untouched wartime interior, still holding enough spatial context to read the crew's final environment. The target is a B-24D Liberator bearing the serial number 41-24311. The objective of this investigation is the forensic documentation and extraction of the forward cockpit section, focusing specifically on the trapped crew members and their preserved operational environment. This is not a salvage operation aimed at recovering bulk aluminum. It is a precise archaeological retrieval governed by strict baseline conditions. The historical anchor for this structure is a specific combat mission flown on August 1, 1943. The operation involved a low-altitude strike on industrial infrastructure, but the resulting evidence field was created when the aircraft ditched far from its intended recovery base. The wreckage settled off the coast of Turkey, ending the immediate flight sequence and beginning a prolonged period of environmental interaction. Between the sinking and the eventual recovery effort in 1995, more than half a century of continuous saltwater immersion acted on the airframe. The wreck itself had reportedly been known to local divers before the formal recovery operation began. This timeline gap defines the primary constraint of the target zone. Half a century in a shallow marine environment alters the structural load capacity of aviation alloys. Salt water acts as an electrolyte, accelerating galvanic corrosion between dissimilar metals used in the aircraft construction. The ocean floor at 90 feet also subjects the wreckage to cyclical coastal currents, which introduce abrasive suspended sediments that slowly scour the exterior skin. Yet despite these aggressive environmental factors, the central section of the forward fuselage maintained its overall geometry. The isolation of the flight deck created an undisturbed interior baseline. The structural envelope of the nose section effectively protected the internal layout from heavy external debris intrusion. Within this confined space, the remains of the pilot and copilot stayed secured at their respective flight stations. This preservation created a rare evidentiary window. Personal artifacts remained where they had been worn or stowed during the mission, giving investigators the primary anchor proof needed to verify crew identity. Treating this zone as a forensic site means that nothing can be shifted or removed without first recording its exact spatial coordinates. The location of the wreck off the coast of Turkey places it squarely within a complex recovery domain. At that accessible depth, bottom time was sufficient for detailed mapping, but the procedural discipline remained absolute. The forensic team must manage the site as a closed evidentiary unit. Every structural deformation, from collapsed overhead panels to heavily oxidized flight controls, must be evaluated before any physical interaction takes place. Access, therefore, had to be planned around the weakened load paths. Any clearing or lifting method needed to protect fragile rivets, bulkheads, and movable evidence before the enclosed flight deck could be extracted. The low-level attack profile put the bombers close enough to the terrain to remain inside the lethal envelope of ground-based anti-aircraft fire. During the bombing run, the aircraft sustained direct flak hits to the nose section and the No. 2 engine. The immediate physical consequence was the instant death of the bombardier and severe structural damage to the forward compartment. Simultaneously, the No. 2 engine ignited, rapidly deteriorating the aerodynamic efficiency of the aircraft and introducing a severe fire hazard. Evasive action was severely limited by the spatial geometry of the mission. The bombers were committed to a low-level attack path in close proximity to other aircraft, where any abrupt break could have created a collision risk or exposed the formation to even greater danger. The pilot held his line through the flak zone, accepting structural punishment rather than making a violent deviation at minimum altitude. This tactical constraint kept the aircraft under continuous exposure until it finally cleared the target area. Once clear of the immediate threat, the mechanical deficits became unrecoverable. The burning No. 2 engine failed entirely, and another engine soon lost power, leaving the heavy bomber with severe asymmetric drag, reduced lift, and no safe margin at its current weight. The crew implemented an aggressive weight reduction protocol. To maintain forward airspeed, they jettisoned their remaining bomb load, heavy ammunition, and all accessible loose equipment. When this proved insufficient to arrest their descent, they faced a stark engineering trade-off. They threw their inflatable life preservers overboard. That choice kept the crippled bomber moving toward the coast, while leaving the crew exposed once it reached the water. The loss of 2 power plants made reaching a friendly airfield impossible. The flight path terminated off the coastline, forcing an emergency ditching in darkness. Landing a damaged heavy bomber on water requires a precise angle of attack to prevent the aircraft from violently breaking apart. The prior flak damage had severely weakened the lower structural frames. Upon striking the water, the compromised forward fuselage fractured under the hydrodynamic load. The aircraft design remained inherently vulnerable during water landings because of its high wing configuration and large lower fuselage volume. As water rushed into the shattered flight deck, the nose submerged rapidly, trapping the pilot and copilot inside the cockpit area. The aft section remained buoyant just long enough for the rest of the crew to escape. 7 surviving crew members evacuated the disintegrating airframe and entered the water. Without life preservers, the 7 survivors had to swim for the beach. Their survival depended on the distance the crippled bomber had gained before ditching. The immediate flight sequence concluded as the surviving crew reached the shore, while the aircraft descended through the water column and struck the seabed. From that point, the investigation shifted from survival to location. Where exactly had the shattered forward section come to rest on the coastal shelf? Locating a submerged aircraft typically relies on acoustic beacons, recorded radar tracks, or precise distress coordinates. In the search for the lost B-24, investigators did not possess a clean, modern position fix from the night of the ditching. The impact had occurred in darkness under extreme duress, leaving no dependable wartime coordinate for the lost site. Survivor memory helped bring the story back to the correct stretch of Turkish coastline, but it did not, by itself, solve the geometry of the wreck. The decisive location evidence came when local diver knowledge intersected with the survivors' return to the coast. Moving the dive vessel to the known area placed the target roughly 750 feet offshore. This distance from the beach provided a practical boundary for the subsequent dive. Operating close to the coast introduces complex search environments. The seabed near the shoreline is subjected to continuous wave action, tidal shifting, and sediment transport, which can bury or mask aluminum wreckage. Furthermore, the uneven coastal shelf can complicate broad survey work. The dive team deployed directly into the heavily localized coordinate box. Upon descending to the seabed, the divers achieved visual contact with the primary wreckage. The initial structural assessment confirmed the forward section of the heavy bomber, heavily encrusted, yet still architecturally recognizable. Its distinctive nose framing allowed divers to identify the target without physically clearing the metal. The wreck's condition immediately set the boundaries for the next phase. Investigators established a non-intrusive grid around the localized structure, using control points to define the edges of the debris field without disturbing the compartment. During this grid assessment, they observed that the overall aircraft had not survived as a single cohesive unit. The specific target compartment was isolated from the scattered secondary debris. This placed the team over the primary forensic site, not merely near the scattered debris around it. Exterior documentation showed an airframe too fragile for casual access. The weakened envelope was sensitive to local current and contact, and the overhead panels had to be treated as potential collapse hazards above the primary evidence. How do you safely breach a fragile, 52-year-old aluminum structure without destroying the primary evidence inside? To preserve the primary evidence, the operational plan mandated a sectional lift. The forward fuselage would be isolated from secondary debris, even though the exact separation mechanics remain undocumented in the public record. That plan protected the evidence only if the interior was recorded and secured before tension entered the rigging. Inside the confined, darkened cockpit, silt and marine growth became the immediate hazard. Divers advanced slowly so the sediment layers holding the artifacts in place would not be displaced. This controlled entry brought the team to the cockpit stations, where the 2 trapped flight crew members had remained inside the flooded forward section. Surrounding these stations, divers documented highly specific personal items that served as immediate identifying anchors. The team recovered a pair of cowboy boots, pearl-handled revolvers, aviator sunglasses, a wristwatch, and a 1943 nickel. Extracting these artifacts required precise handling, as leather and metal degrade at different rates when submerged. Once the sensitive artifacts and human remains were carefully extracted and secured in transfer containers, the engineering focus shifted to the physical ascent of the structure. The recovery team deployed a series of calculated lift bags attached to the primary rigging points. Inflating these bags required constant adjustments to balance the uneven weight distribution of the severed nose section. With the aft structure gone, the nose section had to be balanced as a fragile, self-contained load. The divers continuously monitored the line tension as the forward fuselage broke its suction with the seabed. Managing the ascent rate was critical to prevent trapped air or shifting water pockets from destabilizing the load. The localized lift brought the compartment through the water column without crushing the evidence envelope. The structure finally breached the surface of the Mediterranean, ending its half-century of marine isolation. Once at the surface, the recovery crew utilized a deck crane to carefully transfer the dripping fuselage onto a specialized recovery barge. The cradle system on the barge had to support the uneven lower frames to prevent the nose from collapsing under its own weight, now that the buoyant force of the water was removed. Physical extraction from the seabed shifted the problem from engineering to jurisdiction. Because the wreck was recovered in Turkish coastal waters but remained United States military property under sovereign immunity, the wreckage, artifacts, and human remains required formal coordination before transfer. That overlap stalled the movement of the evidence from the recovery barge to its final destination. The most sensitive legal element was the custody of the pilot and copilot. International protocols required a documented chain of custody as soon as the remains came ashore, separate from the mechanical wreckage. Investigative personnel recorded and secured the remains for transfer through official United States channels, with embassy and military authorities becoming involved in the repatriation process. This protocol preserved dignity, identification value, and government control while the terms of transfer were resolved. Simultaneously, the team had to manage the personal artifacts removed from the flight deck. Those items required an unbroken documentary trail to retain their historical and forensic value. Custody transfer logs were generated for every single artifact. Each item was assigned a specific reference number and its storage location was continuously tracked. Until the clearances were resolved, the artifacts remained in a controlled holding pattern at the local coastal facility. This diplomatic stall introduced a severe material hazard. While the legal teams negotiated, the chemical clock on the physical evidence was actively running, pulling 52-year-old aluminum from a stable marine environment and exposing it to atmospheric oxygen triggers aggressive oxidation. As surface salt water evaporates, salt crystals expand inside microscopic pores and act like mechanical wedges, forcing metal and leather apart. Without clearance for laboratory transfer, the viable response was dockside mitigation, slow drying, freshwater rinsing, or wet storage where appropriate, and shielding large exposed sections from direct solar heating. The stopgap measures preserved the evidence during the bureaucratic standoff. Eventually, diplomatic channels cleared, and the two nations reached a formal agreement on the recovered site. Jurisdiction over the human remains transferred to the United States military for transport and military burial, while custody of the primary airframe section and associated artifacts remained in Turkey for permanent historical exhibition. With the legal boundary resolved, dockside mitigation gave way to full conservation treatment. The forward fuselage moved from the coastal holding facility into a specialized laboratory environment, where the work shifted to active chemical stabilization of the aluminum skin and internal framing. Marine aviation wrecks are thoroughly contaminated with chloride ions that penetrate corrosion layers and remain trapped in joints, skins, and fittings. To slow the damage, conservators use controlled desalination and stabilization treatments, testing rinse water or treatment solutions as salts leach out over time. The exact setup depends on the size of the recovered structure, the available conservation facility, and the fragility of the artifact. This process requires careful environmental control because rapid drying, heat, or humidity swings can shock weakened structural frames. The laboratory team had to prevent already corroded joints, rivets, and skins from failing under new mechanical or chemical stress. Simultaneously, the conservation team addressed the problem of galvanic corrosion between dissimilar metals. The bomber was constructed using various alloys, heavy steel fittings, and copper electrical wiring. In a marine environment, these metals react against each other, sacrificing the weaker aluminum structure. Conservators manually isolated these contact points, applying localized inhibitors to neutralize the reactive zones without disassembling the primary bulkheads. The localized artifacts recovered from the flight deck demanded entirely distinct stabilization workflows. Leather items require chemical treatments to displace absorbed water with inert synthetic waxes. This specialized substitution prevents the organic fibers from shrinking, hardening, and cracking as they transition to a dry environment. The metal components from the cockpit require different stabilizing techniques. Items such as the sidearms required specialist metal conservation. Depending on their condition and alloy, conservators could use controlled cleaning, desalination, corrosion stabilization, or electrochemical treatment to arrest further decay. The objective was not to make the objects look new, but to stabilize the structural core of each artifact while preserving original markings and visible wear patterns. The same recovered state logic governed the forward fuselage. Crushed lower bulkheads, visible impact damage, and marine incrustation were stabilized as evidence rather than erased. For long-term display, engineers added an internal support framework that distributed the section's weight and kept the weakened ribs from sagging under gravity. The stabilized wreckage section and the conserved personal artifacts were permanently integrated into the Rahmi M. Koç Museum in Istanbul. They are mounted in a specialized exhibition space designed to shield the fragile materials from ultraviolet light and fluctuating internal humidity. The display closes the recovery arc without overstating it. The operation repatriated the trapped flight deck crew, preserved the most significant recovered sections, and converted a severely degraded B-24 into a stabilized historical record. Public sources do not clearly confirm the full disposition of every remaining wing or aft component, and later reporting indicates that additional wreckage may also have been recovered or displayed.